When I was in high school, I had a friend who we will call Naomi. We were best friends. We met in humanities class. There were loads of girls in that class, but we bonded because we were both kind of nerdy. She was an interesting one. She had long black hair. It wasn't ever styled, and it looked like it had never been cut. Once in swimming class, I noticed that she wasn't shaving her armpits either. Au naturel. That's alright. Maybe it was a lifestyle choice, I thought. She was such a good listener, and she was always so kind. She had such a great sense of humor too. She was very important to me, and we created some wonderful memories together. Back then, my desire to get married and live a mature life after school was really strong. I would say things like, as soon as we graduate, I can't wait to meet a guy and settle down and get married. She would then say, "That's right. Of course you know you can't get with a guy until after marriage, though." It was a bit of a surprising remark. Women these days, their thought process has changed, but we know, don't we? We protect our purity. She was my best friend, and I agreed with her in a sense. Marrying your true love, a love that's pure. It's an appealing idea. Because I had agreed with her, she seemed very impressed with me, and she would shower me with praise, and treated me with more attention than anyone else in our circle. Shortly after this, Naomi unfortunately had to move away, and I was really cut up about it. I didn't want to lose my best friend, but as life dictates, we have to turn a page sometimes. And as a leaving gift, she gave me a book. She told me that this book was really important to her. And of course, I was grateful to get a parting gift from her. I looked at the cover, dust jacket, of the book, and it was beautifully handmade. Naomi had made it for me. I flipped through it, and I felt a knot in my stomach. Just by glancing at the contents and noting the author's name, I guessed that this was probably written by some kind of leader of a new religion or sect. The book claimed that the founder of this religion was in communication with all the world leaders and was a very important person. It showered their leader with praise. It was sickly. It's a wonderful book, and I'm sure you, of all people, will understand it. So please read it, Naomi said. Back when I was in high school, I was only really interested in fiction books, and I had no interest in this book. I was really sad to see her go, but I received a postcard from her not too long after she left. The writing she had used was so small, I had to use a magnifying glass just to read it. I wondered why she wouldn't just send a letter, but she explained in the postcard that stamps were too expensive. That seemed really strange to me. Since when did stamps become unaffordable? She asked me in the postcard to call an international number. She was now studying abroad in Korea. I called her, and she said that she was in a Korean language study school. Her family had moved abroad as well. But they couldn't afford to call anyone or pay to send a letter. Over the phone she said things like, "I'm so happy to hear from you. I haven't got used to living in Korea yet, but you have to call me again, please." I was going to university that year, and I thought I would call her often, since I would also be lonely in a new place. I managed to rack up a huge phone bill on these long international calls. I had never made any international calls before. I had no idea how expensive they were. I was only 18. As time went by, I got more involved in my studies and just college life in general. The calls were less frequent, and I found less and less time to reply to her postcards. I found them harder to respond to as well. She started to sound less and less like herself. It was heartbreaking. I remember one postcard, which she had sent to my parents' house. "Did I do something wrong to you? You're so pure, kind, and gentle. I miss your warm feelings. And I'm just so stupid that I unintentionally hurt you. You're such a great and wonderful person. And I'm just such a lowly, terrible person. I am sorry. I'm just so sorry." I'm not as she says I am, and she knew that. I didn't like this groveling, self-loathing person that she had become. It was as if all of her personality, everything that made Naomi Naomi, had been ground out of her. I came back to my parents' house on break from uni, and my mum handed me another postcard. This time, it looked different. It came from a new address. The address was from a well-known cult-like religion. It seems now she was a devotee, a follower, living with all the other followers. Now the changing schools and moving abroad in the middle of the semester made perfect sense. I remember one time in history class, she argued with the teacher about a fact, a historical fact, and it created a bad vibe in the class. I should have guessed then and there that she was learning things with a different narrative from somewhere other than school. Eventually, as the years went by, I stopped receiving postcards. One day, I just woke up and I really wanted to see how she was. So I sent a postcard to her address in Japan. She had always told me that her studies abroad would be temporary, and I hoped that she would be back. The thought of her being in some cult frightened me, and it had been playing on my mind. My postcard came back to me, returned to sender. Her family was no longer at that address. I wonder if she's safe wherever she is now. I hate that religion. She was such a good person, my best friend. And even if she had intentions on recruiting me to her cult with all her postcards, I still miss her. The scariest thing to me is that after she left, no one in our friend circle spoke about her again. It was as if she didn't exist. I mean, maybe they were getting postcards too. Or maybe they were aware of the personal hell she was in and didn't want to think about it. If I see any of my friends from school again anytime soon, I'll ask if they heard from Naomi. But I doubt it. I was followed by a cult member. This happened a long time ago, back in the early 90s. I was living in Yamanashi at the time. I had a close circle of friends, and we used to go out regularly. We used to enjoy driving around, chatting, playing music. It was around this time the Aum Shinrikyo cult were making a name for themselves as a strange and suspicious cult. Later, they would become famous for the sarin gas attacks in 1995 in Tokyo and Nagano. They became known as the Doomsday Cult, a truly dangerous group of people intent on hurting others. They organized 5 attacks. They released sarin gas on 3 lines of the Tokyo metro during rush hour, killing 13 people and injuring 5,500 others. They were also responsible for carrying out other assassination and terrorist attacks. They wanted to start World War III. They wanted to start the apocalypse that they believed in. Now, this story takes place before the cult were apprehended. Back then, we all knew of the cult. We just thought they were a bunch of madmen. One of their institutions, or whatever you want to call it, was in our city. We saw them around. They freaked people out. No one wanted to go near their institution. It later became public knowledge that their chemical warfare production plant was based in my hometown. They seemed not to want or have any relationships with anyone in the town. One night, we were bored and we were just driving around, and we found their warehouse. It looked really suspicious. If only I knew then what we all know now, we would have never approached it. We had no idea how close to danger we were. We stupidly got out of the car to check it out. We were goofing around, making noise, and just being dumb. When we got back in the car, a van pulled out of the facility and began to follow us. At first, we were laughing it off, and I was taunting my friend who was driving by saying things like, "Hey, that van's following us." It stopped being a joke when the van followed us no matter which way we turned. One of my friends in the car decided we should try to lose them by going through some twisting back roads. Roads that my friends and I were sure that were only known to us. Dirt roads, shortcuts, etc. No matter where we went, that van followed us. "We are being followed," my friend who was driving finally admitted. The laughter had all faded away at this point. He was going well above the speed limit. The van was right behind us. It wasn't going to leave us alone. I could sense my friend's stress. He kept muttering curse words and scratching his head. I was desperately trying to think of any way I could help. All I could offer was just try and shake him off for now. We decided we would try our best to go above the speed limit in a residential area in the hope that it would attract the attention of someone, anyone, preferably the cops. My friend was gunning it around the area. I recognized the neighborhood as we crested a hill. We then sped down it. Fortunately, one of my friends lived in the area. There was a chance we could shake them. The van disappeared momentarily, so we took our chance and we parked the car in front of somebody's house, turned off all the lights, laid low, and cut the engine. We were too scared to even talk, let alone move. After a couple of seconds, something which sounded like a van sped past us. We waited for a while, and we didn't hear any other traffic on the road. We guessed that the coast was clear. My friend who was driving popped his head up and saw that the van wasn't in sight, and then we were off. I didn't want to be alone that night, so I stayed at my friend's apartment. There was a lot of curtain twitching that night. We were jumping at the sound of cars passing below on the street. About a week later, I was watching the news. It was covering the Tokyo gas attacks, and I noticed a building which seemed familiar. It was one of the cult's warehouses. For all we knew, that's where the gas came from. Actually, it was. The weird building on the TV was the warehouse in our town, the facility that we had gone to investigate. No mistake. Back in those days, mobile phones weren't so common, so I can't imagine what might have happened if that van caught up to us, or if we got out to confront whoever was driving it. My friend who drove us that night was so stressed out through fear of retribution from the cult, he sold his car. Of course, he told the auto dealer the situation before selling it. He found out later that the used car place ended up scrapping the car, as more details about the cult became common knowledge. My parents are in a cult. I grew up in it. It was all I knew for the longest time. As far as I can remember, there were 10 executives, which basically meant leaders, and the cult had approximately 200 followers. I remember vaguely before the cult, my father, he worked for a trading company somewhere. Unfortunately, before long, he became an executive, and we all left our family home and moved into the cult's dormitory-style housing. I was in the first year of elementary. My brother was also at the same school, but he was a couple of years older than me. Everything changed for my family that autumn. We were the only kids at school who were attending classes 3 days a week, and it made us kind of outcasts with our classmates. I remember that teachers were annoyed at this arrangement and wanted us to go to school more. Our parents were called in to speak to the teachers at one point, and that really sticks out in my mind because, after that, there was no more school. From that day forward, after breakfast, we would have religious studies, which basically meant reciting cult doctrine or participating in ritualistic ceremonies. Then after, we had the luxury of working in the compound. This meant that we would either work indoors or in the many acres behind the compound, which they owned. Outdoor work was field work, planting seeds, maintaining crops, feeding animals, that kind of thing. I don't like to cast my mind back to those days so often, but I remember that the chickens were scary and the goats were cute. Mum and Dad lived in this sort of rhythmic happiness together. They barely noticed or cared about my brother and I, or what we got up to. He was a kind brother. He taught me maths and how to read, all in secret in bed at nighttime by torchlight. I remember one night, about roughly a year into our life in the compound, My brother was teaching me as usual, in the silence of the night. He turned to me and whispered, "This place is no good. Mum and Dad aren't Mum and Dad anymore. We shouldn't be here. I want you to come with me." I understood that at the time to mean, Mum and Dad have gone to the other side. Like a game or a film, they joined the wrong team. A bad team. There was no turning back. There was to be no more childhood if I stayed in the compound. Just work and religious studies. I knew, even at that age, that there would be no more school, and my whole life would be in that compound, in the cult. I would love to tell you that this was a heart-aching decision, but the sad reality was, I wanted to go. My brother wasn't lying. They weren't my parents anymore. They weren't themselves anymore. They were without personality, like the others, just empty shells, and we had to go. The next night my brother told me to sleep wearing some thick clothes. He woke me up in the dead of night, and we exacted our plan to escape the compound. He had intentionally left the door to one of the fields unlocked for the past few nights, and because it had gone unnoticed, he thought it would be the best way to make a break for it. In the cold hours before daybreak, we crossed the fields, and then slipped through a weak point in the barbed wire into the forest behind the compound. After a while, we saw the lights of a city up ahead in the distance. My brother was carrying me on his back. He was panting heavily. When he couldn't carry me any further, he grabbed me by the wrist and pulled me along. Slowing down wasn't an option. We found a bus stop, and we waited there for the longest time, in the cold, until a bus came along. We got on and got off at a train station I hadn't heard of. All the while, I kept looking over my shoulder, and I was feeling incredibly guilty. I remember that my brother asked the staff at the station something. We changed trains more times than I can remember. Each time my brother would use a payphone at the station, and then somehow, we ended up somewhere familiar. I felt like I had been to this station. When we exited the station, there were some adults, and they approached us. "You're a and right?" I hid behind my brother, and he turned to me and whispered, "It's okay." He smiled. I forgot what his smile looked like. It turns out the people who greeted us at the station were there to help. My brother's former teacher from school, his lawyer friend, and a policeman. My brother seemed to know, or was told, that even though we would escape our parents and the cult, they would be able to get us back to the cult because they had custody over us. Eventually, we were moved into a facility for children. And we grew up, living life completely devoid of our parents. We went back to school, graduated, and we got scholarships. We got to go to college. My brother helped me the whole way. We studied at night, just like we did in the compound. It felt great to get good grades at school after feeling as if we missed out on so much. I can tell you that the most terrifying thing about those days in the cult was the feeling of being trapped in a spider's web. Like the more we struggled, the more futile it felt. But that's all in the past now. There's nothing but the horizon ahead of me. I don't have any time to waste on fear anymore. Thanks for listening to my story.